My name is Randi Foraker from the University of Missouri. I'm also chair-elect for the EPI Council in the American Heart Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome the Stamler Award finalists today who are going to share with you their work, and I'm going to have the opportunity to ask them some questions. But first, I'd like them to introduce themselves, starting over here with Bahar.
Hi, my name is Bahar Bakhshi, and I'm a PhD candidate within the Molecular and Translational Medicine program at Boston University Chobanian and Abedisian School of Medicine.
Hi, my name is Francis Wang. I am a medical student at Temple University with an affiliation at Beth Israel.
Hi, my name is Jin Dai. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in epidemiology at Tulane University.
Hello, my name is Mohan Satish. I'm a clinical cardiovascular disease and T32 postdoctoral fellow at New York Presbyterian/Weill Cornell.
Hello, my name is Sophie Claudel. I am a nephrology fellow at Boston Medical Center.
Great to have you all here. I would like to start with Bahar. And if you could give us a brief summary of the work that you did, and then also tell us a bit about what made your research question particularly challenging and interesting for you to address.
Thank you, Randy. I'm part of an interdisciplinary lab called Digital Health and Network Multi-omics, and our overarching interest is utilizing wearable digital health technologies like the continuous glucose monitors to help characterize cardiometabolic risk and its heterogeneity in people who already don't have cardiometabolic disease. So particularly for this presentation at AHA, I'm looking at the link between continuous glucose monitor-derived measures of glycemic variability and glycemic burden with hepatic steatosis and fibrosis. And going back to your second question, I think something that is challenging but also really exciting is that this field is particularly young, utilizing continuous glucose monitors in individuals who don't have cardiometabolic disease like diabetes has only just started. So sort of figuring out how to leverage the data in the best way possible and the analytical techniques that we need to utilize to best inform the associations has been challenging but also really fun.
Thank you so much, Bahar. Moving on to Francis, could you give us a brief summary of your work and also tell us a bit about why the general public should care about the work that you did?
That's a great question. Thank you. A little bit of background about our work. We were interested in evaluating environmental exposures and effects on child metabolic health. So we took a look at a few PFAS, which are chemicals that are persistent in the environment that are found throughout food packaging and also in clothing items. They're produced widely industrially, and exposures to it come through over water sources, drinking water, and then also through just exposures to dirt as well. So in our study, we took a look at the association between prenatal PFAS exposure and also cardiometabolic health, specifically blood pressure in children. And then we found that with increased PFAS exposure, especially certain PFAS, including PFOS, they were strongly associated with increased child blood pressure. So currently, the EPA has water guidelines that recently rolled out to filter out PFAS in the general water supply. And we are interested, and there has also been talk on rolling back these regulations as well. So this is especially interesting for the general public because we are understanding that long-term effects of exposures to these chemicals can have a meaningful impact on guiding policy and also exposure.
Thank you, Francis. I'd like to move on to Jean. If you could please tell us a bit about the work that you did, and then also for those that are interested in answering questions similar to yours, what advice would you give them? What are some of the lessons that you learned that you would like to impart on researchers?
Cool. Thank you so much for this great question. So, light is the single most important time cue for entraining the human circadian systems. And experimental studies have suggested that proper time the light, such as brighter day and dark nights, may synchronize our human circadian systems, while the mistimed light, such as brighter light at night, may disrupt the circadian rhythm. And epidemiological studies have consistently suggested that greater nighttime light exposure was associated with increased adverse cardiovascular disease risk factor profiles and also a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. But we knew that CVD is a continuum. It does not start with a heart attack, but otherwise, like silently, like decades early, with the accumulation of the risk factor to the subclinical cardiac remodeling and dysfunction and leading to the manifestation of the cardiovascular disease. So there is an important questions remain unanswered, whether the nighttime light exposure was associated with cardiac remodeling and dysfunction, and our study was set out to fill this research gap. And we found that greater nighttime light exposure was associated with adverse cardiac remodeling and dysfunction, and also highlighting an important role of maintaining the adequate sleep, because we found that sleep was partly mediated the association between the nighttime light exposure and cardiac remodeling and dysfunction. Regarding your second question, regarding what advice I should give to the researchers, I think the first of all is to understand the physiology of the circadian rhythm. So we know that some factors may affect circadian rhythm, such as the light, diet, and physical activity. And the second one is how to define the daytime and nighttime, because we know that some people are early birds and some people are night owl. So basically, if you use a fixed time window to define the daytime and nighttime, you may not fully capture the individual variability in their circadian rhythm. So I think this is advice, because for some studies we may only conduct the literature review for epidemiological research, but for this type of research, you may also understand the physiology. Yeah, that's it.
Excellent. Thank you, Jean. Very interesting work. And Mohan, moving on to you, I'm interested in hearing more about the work that you did, but also thinking about the next questions or the future directions of this work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Randy. What I will say is that we made a lot of strides with the advent of the 2023 Prevent CVD risk equations and otherwise its subcomponents. And anytime a risk equation comes out, we naturally ask, what is the prevalence of said risk equations? And we find that a large population of folks have what we understand to be low 10-year CVD risk in addition to high 30-year CVD risk. And when you couple this with more recent epidemiology trends in younger folks where that is applicable for us to assess that type of risk, long-term risk, what we know is that the epidemiology in young adults, unfortunately, has changed, where we're seeing rising incidence both in terms of myocardial infarction, ischemic stroke, as well as heart failure particularly. So we sought to look at this in the context of the biracial nationwide cohort study called the REGARD study, to assess what is both the prevalence and likewise the incidence of cardiovascular disease if we can start to couple 10-year and 30-year prevent risk. So we looked at low 10-year risk, low 10-year and low 30-year risk, and likewise low 10-year and high 30-year risk, and as well as a high 10-year risk, and try to compare these three groups. And we found that this is a progressively higher, we see progressively higher CVD incidence in these three distinct risk groups. Almost a threefold higher incidence in the low 10, high 30-year CVD risk group as compared to those with low 10, low 30-year risk group. So that's one way in which we can start to think about, three different risk profiles using coupling the 10 and 30-year risk by the prevent risk equations. In addition to that, we looked at risk factor contributions. And when we looked at risk factor contributions, we found that hypertension was the most strongest contributor to incident CVD in those with low 10-year risk and high 30-year risk, cardiovascular disease risk. So what this allows us, during your questions well taken, is that it allows us to start to understand, can we start to think about scalable interventions, especially when we think about the issue sometimes is kind of in the fix of implementation issues. Can we start to think about scalable interventions, coupling 10 and 30-year risk in younger folks to potentially reduce long-term CVD? So this is the start to sort of think about it in the context of using the prevent equations.
Great. Thank you, Mohan. And Sophie, last but not least, I'm curious to hear more about your work. And as I was reading about it, I was thinking how this might impact physicians and patients' everyday lives. So if you could tell us a bit about that from your perspective, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So we were very interested in understanding cardiovascular disease as a risk factor for new kidney disease or incident kidney disease, because we know there's a strong relationship between the heart or cardiovascular system and kidney disease, but it's mostly been studied in individuals who already show signs of kidney disease. And so we wanted to know, after a cardiovascular event, does that increase the risk of new kidney disease? And so we studied this, and we studied specific types of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular events, and we found a very strong association between the two. And so in particular, it seemed that heart failure and atrial fibrillation were very strongly associated with new or incident CKD, which is something that is very relevant not only to clinicians but also to patients in thinking about how do we screen patients for kidney disease and who should be eligible for kidney disease screening. And so in our analyses and in our ultimate paper, we'll be discussing a bit more about how we consider cardiovascular disease as a risk factor for kidney disease and the intensity of monitoring for kidney events after a cardiovascular event.
Wonderful. Thank you all for sharing your work with me as well as answering my questions. And I've just been really impressed by these Stamler Award finalists and particularly their expertise in their areas as early career researchers. And so thank you all for joining me, and we look forward to your presentations and the awards later today. Thank you.